Hello and welcome to today's seminar. My name is Mikael Witteblad and I'm the head of the research program here at SNS. Today's seminar is part of a collaboration between SNS and the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. The aim of this collaboration is to bring insights from leading international economists to the Swedish policy debate. Therefore, we're very glad to have two prominent economists with us today and one minister to discuss the policies for reducing the gender gap at the labor market. First, Barbara Petrongolo, professor of economics at Queen Mary University of London, will present her research on different types of family policies that affect women's outcome on the labor market. Then Arizo Karimi, a postdoctoral researcher at Uppsala University, the Economics department, will comment and give a Swedish perspective. After that, Åsa Lindhagen, Minister for Gender Equality, will share the government's view on different types of policies. So warm welcome to all of you. We're very honored to have you here. This seminar will be moderated by Agneta Berge. You're a PhD student at IIES. Before I hand over to you, Agneta, I just would like to remind you all that you can share what is said here today, and if you would like to do so, you can use our hashtag SNS Kunskap. So the floor is yours, Agneta.
Okay, yes. Right, hi. So I am Agneta Berge, a PhD student at the IIES, like Mikael said. And one of the greatest structural transformations of the labor market in Sweden and in other countries in the last sort of 50 years has been the rise in female employment. But how did actually this great transformation come about? We normally talk about a bunch of different policies, like parental leave and childcare and different tax policies. But what do we actually know about the effectiveness of these policies? And what about the remaining gaps? On average, women still have lower employment rate than men, they have lower wages than men, they work fewer hours than men, and they have more short-term contracts than men. How do we close these gaps? Today, I'm very happy to be warming up for International Women's Day, together with these excellent researchers that Mikael has introduced, and with the Minister for Gender Equality, and with this prominent audience, learning more about precisely these issues. So I'm happy to, first of all, we'll leave the word to Barbara Petrongolo, who will give her presentation on her research. We'll then leave room for maybe one or two questions from the audience. Then Arizo, Karimi and Åsa Lindhagen will present. And then we will have a panel discussion, and we will leave room for many questions during the panel discussion. So save a bunch of questions for the last part of the seminar. Okay, so with those words, I welcome you, Barbara Petrongolo, to the stage.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and most of all, thanks for this invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and talk about my work and other related work on family policies. So, just to give a bit of context, undoubtedly, the increase in female involvement in the labor market has been one of the most important economic and social changes during the 20th century. And women have made inroads into labor market across all possible kind of dimensions in terms of human capital accumulation, employment growth, pay convergence with respect to men, occupational progression, and so on. Nevertheless, there are still large and persistent disparities remaining in the labor market outcomes of men and women in most high-income countries. So these are the countries in which I'm collecting data, I'm putting together data today. So just to give you a very, very brief idea, in the UK, At present, women earn on average 22% less than men on an hourly basis, and their employment rate is about 12 percentage points lower. In the US, the picture is very, very similar to what we've seen in the UK. In continental Europe, gender gaps are lower and employment gaps are higher. And all this is all the more striking because what this is happening is against a backdrop of completely equalized education opportunities and anti-discrimination legislation, so equal pay legislation. So this is a little bit of context. Why do we care about this? Is this a problem? Why is this a problem? And then here the important view to send across is that this is not just an equity problem of sort of equity between men and women, it might also be an efficiency problem, a problem about the optimal allocation of talent across jobs in the economy. So innate talent is equally distributed among men and women, so there is no evidence that those distributions might be different. If anything, girls perform better than boys in school, and young women invest more in education than young men. So with this kind of backdrop, the efficient allocation of workers to jobs requires that individuals do those jobs in the economy for which they have the best comparative advantage, the jobs that maximize the returns to their skill. So selecting mostly from one pool, let's say selecting mostly from the male pool, inevitably reduces the efficient allocation of skills to tasks. Okay, so we may end up with a sub-efficient allocation of workers to jobs if we mostly select individuals, especially for top position, from one pool of workers. And indeed, there is recent work that has shown that over the past 2 or 3 decades, about a quarter of the growth rate in GDP per head in the US was explained by the fact that the barriers that women were traditionally facing when entering the education system, higher education, or were entering professional and managerial jobs were gradually removed. And the removal of those barriers has contributed to about 25% of GDP per head growth. Okay, so this is the kind of evidence I have in mind. So this is a very coarse way to summarize the kind of gender gaps that persist today in OECD countries. So as you can see on the horizontal axis, employment rate of women varies dramatically across these countries, from a low of 30%, for example, in Turkey. Again, relatively low employment rates in Southern Europe, between 40 and 50%. And then very high employment rates at the other extreme of this picture, especially in Scandinavian Nordic countries, so to see, even between 70 and 80%. On the vertical axis, we have the gender pay gap. Again, the gender pay gap is particularly low in countries like, again, Southern Europe, some Scandinavian countries, and it is instead quite high in Anglo-Saxon countries like the UK and the US. Now, one very important caveat whenever we are talking about comparison across countries with very different participation of women to the labor market, it's not easy, it's not straightforward to compare the gender pay gap because, of course, different employment rates across countries means different selection processes into employment of women across countries. So, for example, very simply, if we believe that women who tend to participate to the labor market are on average women who would earn potentially higher wages than women who don't participate, so women are actually positively selected in the labor market, one would expect that countries with a very low female employment rate may have a small gender wage gap, simply because high wage women participate, low wage women do not feature in the observed wage distribution. So it's tricky to compare pay gaps across countries, but this is the kind of evidence that we have. So probably this selection process I was mentioning is also responsible for the fact that you see some sort of positive relationship between the female employment rate and the gender pay gap. So for example, in the UK and the US, where the majority of women participate to the labor market, then you also expect that by composition you have a higher gender pay gap. So Scandinavian countries are here, so Sweden, Norway, and Denmark are typically characterized by very high employment rates of women above 70% and relatively low gender pay gaps with respect to men, so on average 10%. And then another different sort of scenarios is Anglo-Saxon countries, the UK and the US. Female employment rates are still very high, although lower than in Scandinavia, and the gender pay gap is a lot higher. So this is the pay gap in median earnings. If you look at the pay gap in average earnings, is quite a bit higher. Okay, another piece of evidence that I think it's quite important to bring into the picture is the so-called glass ceiling. The kind of gender inequalities that I was representing in the previous diagram are amplified if we look at the sort of top echelon in the sort of ability or wage distribution. So if we look, for example, at the presence of women in top jobs, where by top jobs I mean managerial positions, corporate sector in general, or position in politics, women are much more underrepresented than in the labor force as a whole. So in this diagram here, the light blue lines represent the proportion of women in the labor force. There's fewer women than men in the labor force, but on average, we're talking about a number between 40 and 50%. So women are between maybe 35 and 48% of the labor force in most countries. But then the dark blue bars represent the proportion of women in top jobs, and this is a lot lower, okay? This is on average like between 25 and 30%. So this is what is known as the glass ceiling. Now, there is now very active research around factors that would explain the remaining gender gaps. So some people have been talking about gender differences in psychological attitudes and preferences towards job attributes, for example, risk or competition or socially minded preferences. There is a big area of research around work-life balance considerations. I mean, if women remain the primary provider of home services and most importantly childcare, this of course sets limits to female involvement in the labor market. And then again, there is something very important that is strictly related to point 2, is what is the impact of social norms and gender identity. Now, in the sake of time, I will move directly to work-life balance considerations, which is basically the most important kind of element, the most important factor that will motivate then the discussion about family policies and their impact. So as I was saying before, as long as women retain the primary role in childcare, this of course sets limit to their involvement in the labor market, and this has a detrimental impact in earnings, especially so in professions that reward continuous attachment. I mean, if we think about this in sort of historical terms, this is perhaps unsurprising, as the work schedules in these professions, in these sort of top jobs, which were historically dominated by men, the kind of work schedules were also largely set by these men who had historically, again, very little family commitment. So it's not surprising that this kind of traditionally male-dominated occupations have work schedules that don't really take into account the sort of dual commitment of workplace work and family work. So we're talking about like high-paying jobs that typically remunerate long hours, inflexible schedules, on-the-job competition, and so on. So these kind of jobs may require continuous labor force attachment and might be quite difficult to combine with job interruptions. And this takes me directly to the role of having children, the role of maternal childcare, and what is the impact of that on the gender pay gap. So I'm showing you a diagram here about the so-called motherhood penalty, which is the gap between the earnings of men and women, which is generated by the arrival of children. So here I'm only comparing, it's not me actually, it's a paper by Clever et al. This paper is comparing the earnings of mothers and fathers after the birth of their first child. So this is the birth of their first child. Before birth, their earnings were on an almost identical trend. After birth, the earnings of men, these two lines refer to the UK and the US respectively, remain basically flat with respect to the pre-birth period, while the earnings of women start declining, and then even 10 years after birth, it seems that the earnings of mothers remain permanently lower, about, in this case, 40% lower than the earnings of father. Okay? So there is like a sizable and permanent impact of parenthood for mothers, but not for fathers. So this is really a sort of a reflection of the fact that mothers are the primary provider of childcare. This is what happens in German-speaking country, an even bigger penalty from motherhood. So here in the long run, again, for men, the trajectory is completely flat. Birth doesn't affect the earnings of men, but it implies a huge drop in the earnings of women, and in the long run, the motherhood penalty is even higher. It's around 60%. The good news for Scandinavian countries is that the long-run penalty is a lot lower. So it's something between 20–28%, but it's still very large, it's significant, and it's also kind of surprising because in this case, we're talking about countries like Denmark and Sweden who have in place a lot of sort of family-friendly policies that should ease the return to work of women after motherhood. So this is exactly where the role of family policies kick in. So the question is, how can we design family policies in a way that best combine careers and motherhood for women? And what is the role of existing family policies in explaining the kind of patterns that we observe in the data? So a little bit of historical context here, I thought it would be interesting. So basically, throughout the 20th century, the rise in the female workforce was accompanied, sometimes preceded, sometimes followed, by legislation targeted at families. So in some cases, the process of sort of legislation was indeed initiated by economic change. So at the beginning of all of that, with the Industrial Revolution and the spreading out of very sort of heavy manufacturing jobs, legislation was required in order to protect female work. So basically work by kind of weaker individuals, physically weaker individuals. In other case, legislation resulted from political change or social change, for example, the women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s. So what is the state of the art today? By the beginning of this century, virtually all high-income countries have in place a rich bundle of policies aimed at the family, very broadly speaking, with multiple goals of gender equity, higher fertility, and child development. Now, throughout decades, different countries, different types of governments, different type of, say, democracies versus autarchies, were emphasizing different roles of family policies. So, for example, with kind of paternalistic forms of government, you mostly emphasize the fertility goal. With more kind of gender equal ideologies, you mostly emphasize the gender equity. But in any case, typically every bundle of family policies has in mind this kind of objectives in the background. So the policy instruments I'm talking about is mostly maternal and paternal leave. This is the most important instrument, the first one that was introduced historically. So this kind of slight distinction between maternity and parental leave. Maternity leave is the leave that mothers can take soon after birth, and this is exclusively dedicated to mothers. And then parental leave is a lot longer, can be taken up to a few years in some countries these days, and can be shared between mother and father. I'm going to be loosely talking about maternity and parental leave in a sort of interchangeable way, because most of parental leave is still taken by mothers. Okay? Now, in most countries, when fathers and mothers come back to work after the birth of the child, they'll still receive some kind of public support in the form of like state-provided or subsidized childcare. So this is the second big chunk in terms of importance, and also in terms of sort of chronological introduction, the chronological order by which it was introduced by some countries. And then finally, probably the most recent case of family policies is something that happens at the workplace level. So here I'm talking, for example, about legislation on part-time work, for example, equal pay legislation for part-time worker, flexible working hours, even more recently telecommuting and so on. So workplace practices that may help parents to combine paid work in the market with unpaid work in the household. So just to summarize views ahead of showing you the evidence, of course, there's the good and bad in all of that. So the main view is, of course, that family policies enable parents, especially women I'm talking about, to combine parenthood and careers, and also the introduction of family policy by stimulating the participation of women to the labor market. They may erode conservative gender norms, so it may have a sort of double effect on two different channels. Now, of course, there is the counter view that some of these policies may actually backfire in the long run. How? By limiting women's professional advancement, so for example, by subsidizing long breaks out of the labor force, and also raising the cost to employers for hiring women of childbearing age. So we have to be really careful here with the empirical evidence to see exactly what policies can do for good and bad things. Okay, this is a very broad, again, a very sort of summary view of family policies and female employment. So here what I'm plotting is the female employment rate in a bunch of OECD countries against the maximum length of parental leave available to mothers. So for short, I will call this maternity leave. Maternity leave varies tremendously across countries, so from a minimum of 12 weeks in the US, completely unpaid, to a maximum of like 3 years in some countries like Germany, Finland, France, and more recently also Austria. Very broadly speaking, there is no systematic relationship between female employment and the length of maternal leave. This is a very, very coarse correlation. So of course, I'm not saying anything here about causality, but at first glance, there is really no smoking gun that the length of maternal leave is either beneficial or detrimental to female employment. Let's look a little bit more into the causal evidence here. So this evidence comes from Austria. Austria is an interesting case. Well, first of all, because it has extremely rich data that can be used to look at the long run parental sort of penalty, parenthood penalty. And also Austria, within the span of about 10 years, has introduced subsequent reforms to the maternity leave system such that the maternity leave has been extended from 1.5 years to 3 years. So there is a lot of variation in this data. And then the eligibility of men and women to alternative schemes, to alternative durations of parental leave, is defined according to the date of birth of their babies. Okay, so all these lines, so the different lines, the different colors refer to different regimes. So this is the black one is the short maternity leave regime, which is 18 months, medium maternity leave regimes, which is 24 months, and then long maternity leave regime, 36 months. So we're really talking about a very long entitlement. So all the lines, they sit completely on top of each other for men. So no news for men. Whatever is the length of parental leave, there is no impact on male earnings of the birth of the first child. This is the impact for women. So if we look at the sort of short maternity leave, this is the black line. Medium maternity leave, this is this blue line. And then very long maternity leave, this is the red line. As you can see, the motherhood penalty increases quite a lot, especially in the short run with the length of maternity leave. And a lot of this impact is actually mechanical because by basically giving women the possibility to stay out of work up to 3 years, then of course their earnings during those 3 years would be lower. So there are very big differences in the short run within 3 years of birth on the sort of response of the motherhood penalty to the length of the leave entitlement. What happens in the long run? These women are returning to work in different proportions. They might be going back to different jobs. In the long run, there isn't so much of a difference regarding to the entitlement leave in the sort of what we observe as the motherhood penalty. So a lot of impact in the short run. So this is mostly like by delaying return to work and much less of an impact in the long run. So what do we learn from this? We learned that definitely positive effects of these very long extensions to maternity leave are completely excluded by the evidence. There are negative effects, mostly in the short run, basically delaying the return to work, and much less in the short run. In the long run, I'm sorry. Now, there's very important caveats to this kind of evidence, which I want to be clear about. First of all, for other countries, the reforms that people were looking at also involve differences in the replacement rate of these leave periods by giving sort of higher or lower cash benefits depending on regimes. So a reform that in Germany increased the cash benefits available to mother also had an impact on long run earning penalties. So cash benefits seem to have a higher negative impact. Now, what is really important to understand this evidence is that this evidence mostly comes from extensions of very long durations. We are talking about 1 year versus 2, 2 years versus 3. Possibly we would be getting a completely different story if we were able to look at very short extensions. For example, a country that has only 12 weeks, what would happen if we extend that to 24 weeks? So this would be like the US evidence. What would happen in a situation, in a context like the US, if we extend the maternity leave from 12 to 24 weeks? Or even more interesting, what happened at the beginning of all this kind of legislation process, early or mid-20th century, when maternity leave was increased from 0 to some positive amount? There, surely I would expect a positive impact on female attachment to the labor market and female employment, but we don't have causal evidence at the moment. Moving on to the second big instrument of family policies, childcare subsidies. So here I'm just showing the correlation with female employment. The way we measure the richness of childcare subsidies is by looking at the share of GDP in a given country that is devoted to early education and early care policies. So this is, for example, very low, basically zero in some Southern European countries, and it gets a lot higher. Again, the usual suspects are like mostly Scandinavian countries, where it gets to about 0.7% of GDP. In this case, the correlation with female employment is clearly positive. We don't know which way the causality works, but definitely the correlation is clearly positive. So what do we learn about the causal impact of childcare subsidies on maternal employment? I mean, there is some evidence of positive impact of subsidized childcare on maternal employment coming from the US, Canada, the Netherlands, and Spain. There's also studies for Norway and France which don't find much of a positive impact. So this evidence, I have to be clear, mostly comes from preschool programs. So programs for 3 to 5-year-olds. We know much less about like childcare just after birth. So this is something that really requires a lot more scrutiny. Something that we should learn from this evidence is that also country-specific contextual factors are very important to understand the impact of this kind of policy. First of all, we have to understand what are the alternatives of state-subsidized or state-provided childcare. Are there sort of cheap alternatives in the private sector? Are there like family networks, informal childcare in place? So in these cases, state-provided childcare would simply crowd out other forms of childcare, so we wouldn't expect much of a change in female employment, which was what happened in Norway back in the 1970s and 1980s when childcare was extended. In other cases in which there is very little substitute to state-provided childcare, this is where we expect most of an effect. Now, what I think is really interesting at this stage is to understand what is the role of gender identity norms in a given context in which we introduce new policy, to understand really what is the impact, the expected impact of policy in different contexts characterized by differently conservative or differently liberal gender norms. Okay, so role of gender identity norms, basically the key point here that I want to send across, that work-life balance considerations wouldn't be a female issue if gender roles were equalized in the household. So basically these issues became a female problem whenever social norms induce an asymmetric gender roles in the household. So very easily speaking, the long hours culture wouldn't be much more of a problem for mothers' earnings than for fathers' earnings if mothers and fathers were the same in the household. So what do we learn about the interaction between policies and norms? Well, one view is that policies may steer the evolution of gender norms toward more gender equal roles as far as they stimulate female employment. Now, we have seen at the moment from current extensions there isn't much stimulation of female employment coming from maternity leave, but probably the situation was very different in the early days. So there was a lot more sort of positive synergies between family policies, gender norms, and female employment. Also, the evolution of norms themselves can create fertile ground for family-friendly legislation. For example, again, the women movements of the 1960s and 1970s. Now, here I would like to emphasize some intended consequences again, so to be the devil's advocate for a minute. So, some policies, especially if they subsidize long periods out of work, may actually reinforce stereotypes around gender roles by delaying the return to work of women after childbirth and basically sending across the message that women would specialize even more in this primary role of home production because the market allows them to do so. Okay? And then you can think, for example, that also family-friendly policies like part-time job arrangement may actually dilute women's job attachment, for example, part-time work, flexi work, telecommuting, and induce women to, again, specialize and concentrate in low-tier jobs or middle-tier jobs that are more permeable to this kind of atypical work arrangements. So, for example, in the UK, there is a lot of part-time work, 42% of women work part-time, but the penalty on part-time jobs is about 25%. And this whole penalty is almost completely explained by the fact that different occupations are available on part-time and full-time basis. So some high-paying jobs are just not available on a part-time basis. And then finally, norms can be a sort of hindrance to policy effect whenever the binding constraint to female participation is a traditional division of labor rather than a lack of cheap substitutes to female work. So this is just showing you what is the motherhood penalty, again in Austria, in two different scenarios. So in the blue scenarios, I'm showing you the motherhood penalty in districts, Austrian districts with very little childcare provision. And the red line is the motherhood penalty in districts with a lot more childcare provision. And as you can see, those penalties are very similar. And the interpretation of this is because we are introducing like differently funded childcare provision in a situation with very conservative gender norms. So for example, in Austria, about 40% of the population in a sort of kind of representative survey declares that they agree with the statement that women with children under school age or school age kids should not be working in the market because children would suffer. And this is very simply what is the correlation between the gender norms measured in the way that I've just said, the proportion agreeing with the statement that children suffer if their mothers work in the market, the correlation with these norms and the childhood penalty. So here you have very gender equal norms in Denmark and Sweden and relatively low motherhood penalty, where low means 25%. So this has all to be in context. UK and US more or less in the middle sort of conservativeness and middle childhood penalty. And then German-speaking countries, huge childhood penalties and much more conservative gender norms. So I'm running out of time. This is just a concluding slide. So what do we learn? Long maternity leave extensions, I really want to emphasize this, do not seem to foster female participation. If anything, there is a delay effect in the return to work. Of course, this conclusion is very hard to generalize to early days or to countries with very limited coverage. So this is where I would like to see more evidence. Subsidized childcare has more beneficial effect. But even so, it may have little impact if we're introducing subsidized childcare in a context with very rigid gender norms about female involvement with children. And then finally, this is the most recent sort of area of legislation. Family-friendly workplace practices do ease female participation, but with a high flexibility penalty. So whatever flexible work arrangements you can think of, they typically come with an attached wage penalty, which is pretty high, for example, 25% in the UK for women. So is this because some top jobs are technically not feasible to adapt to sort of part-time schedules or flexible schedule, or is it because of inertia? Maybe those jobs, again, have been designed by men who didn't have any sort of family responsibilities 40 years back, and then things have always been like that, and then we continue to do them like that with still imposing a penalty for flexibility. So in this case, I think that a very important question is what is going to be the role of technological and organizational change? I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So please stay on the stage. I will just ask one quick question before I
of course
let the next speaker up. So I will just go up here. We would really need like the double of time to go through these questions. They're so interesting. So women are the main caretakers for children, and there's a big penalty in terms of their labor market outcomes. So what about elderly care? Are women also the main caretakers for old parents, and is there a labor market penalty for that? And is there any evidence on the introduction of elderly care, like public elderly care?
Oh, this is a very important point. I'm so pleased you raised that, because we always talk about childcare, but then with the aging of population, of course, elderly care becomes a very important issue. And again, similarly as with childcare, probably even more than with childcare, most of it falls on women. Most of elderly care falls on women. And you may actually have a situation in which women of, say, childbearing age have the double burden of young children and elderly parents to look after more or less at the same time. I am not aware, unfortunately, about sort of studies that look empirically at what is the impact of elderly care on female earnings. I think this is an extremely important area of research. And especially, for example, given that governments do invest and do subsidize elderly care to different extents, I think this is a very important question to bring to the data. So basically, it's just taking the whole focus from early years to late years. Right. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So now, please welcome up Arizo Karimi from Uppsala University.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to give a comment from a Swedish perspective. And there will be some overlap with my presentation with Barbara's, but I guess that's okay because repetition is key to absorbing knowledge. At least that's something that I tell my students. And I'm going to concentrate my comment on family policies and the effectiveness of family policies in this respect. And this is not only because that's where my own research has been concentrated, but also because when we talk about gender equality in the public debate and in terms of policy, in Sweden at least, I think this is where our discussion has stalled. So I just wanted to take a look at what we know and actually give a little bit of a historical perspective. And Sweden, along with the other Scandinavian countries, for example, are in many respects forerunners when it comes to gender equality. So for example, when we think about labor force participation, Sweden reached the 2009 OECD average already in 1974. And there seems to be this widespread belief that this has something to do with the fact that Sweden was also an early adopter when it comes to family policies, in particular paid parental leave with benefits that are tied to previous earnings, salary, and also with equal rights for mothers and fathers. And this expansion took place, or the introduction of paid leave in Sweden took place in 1974, which is quite early in an international perspective. However, as Barbara was talking about, policies are they're not designed in isolation. They might also be a response to changing societal norms or economic conditions. So it's really difficult to know what came first and what caused what. So maybe we can take a little bit of a historical perspective and just look at what do the trends look like in the outcomes that we're interested in before we actually start to introduce these family policies. So this is figures on female labor force participation in Sweden from the labor force surveys that's reported in a paper by Celine. And as you can see, and it's so the top graph is for unmarried women, and the bottom solid line is for married women. And as you can see, already starting in the mid-1960s, there was quite a dramatic or increasing trend in female participation among married women. And this trend has started before we started to introduce a lot of family policies. And this is, again, a graph from figures from the labor force service, but I screenshotted this graph from an old government investigation on reforming the parental leave system in 1975. I think so this is in their background chapter, and it's Swedish, but the lower graph shows the increase or the female participation rates among women with very young children, so women with kids under the ages of 3. And so there was already an increasing trend in the participation among women with young children long before we actually started to introduce a lot of these family policies. So what could potentially explain these figures then, if not family policies? Well, there is one thing that we can think of, and that's the change in the industry composition, mainly the shift away from manufacturing to service sector, which is tend to be concentrated by women. Now, this is not something that is unique to Sweden. It happened elsewhere too, but what may be a little bit more unique to Scandinavia, at least, is that the other side of this same coin in Sweden is the large expansion in the public sector in Sweden during the 1960s. And just to show you some numbers on this, this is cumulative growth in the population, so that's the top graph, and then the middle one in employment in the private sector, public sector, and then the private sector. And as you can see, starting already from the early 1960s, there is a huge expansion in public sector employment. And actually, if you would look at the increase in female participation and break that down across sectors, you would see that the vast majority of the increase in female labor force participation is in the public sector and not in the private sector. And this is at the same time as you see women's relative wages increase, despite the fact that we have a huge influx of women into the labor market. So these things together sort of suggest that there might have been pull factors rather than push that generated this huge expansion of, or this increase in female employment, especially among women with very young children. So this might have prompted a demand for these types of policies from the population perspective. And also in this, at the same time as we have changes in societal norms about women's role and a big discussion about norms in society in general. So policy may be a response to these developments. So when we think about this as economists, we're very focused on trying to understand cause and effect relationships. And we do this by looking at, sometimes at least in empirical economics, which is my field, we look at specific policies which might give us some causal or random exogenous variation in how long people have access to paid leave, for example. And in this respect, we can differentiate between policies that increase the incentives for women's time spent at home, for example, the benefit levels or just the extension or the extent, the duration of paid leave, and policies that are more focused on creating substitutes for women's time spent at home, such as the daddy month reforms that we've been using in the Scandinavian countries, or childcare availability. So let me just give you some examples. An example each from my own research on the effects of these types of policies. So this is using the expansion in paid leave entitlements in Sweden in 1989. And it shows the effect of 1 additional month of paid parental leave on women's earnings by time since birth. So as you can see, women who are entitled to 1 month of additional paid leave have a lower participation in year 1 and 2 after birth, but in the long run there really are no effects. And if you look at earnings, conditional unemployment, you see sort of the same thing. So this is consistent with what Barbara was talking about, that there are short-run negative impacts of these types of policies, but there really doesn't seem to be any impacts in the long run. So what about paternity leave? So you can just focus on this graph here on your right, which just shows the intra-household, so men's intra-household share of parental leave take-up by the month of birth of the child. And these sharp drops that you see in the beginning and in the end of the graph are due to this introduction of the first and the second daddy month reform. So these reforms these types of reforms where you try to create direct substitutes for women's time at home seem to work in terms of making fathers be more responsible. But if you look at how they actually affect the long-term division of household care, it doesn't. They don't seem to be very effective. So this is from a paper by Ekberg and co-authors, where they look at the effect of the first daddy month reform on the on men's take-up of leave to care for sick children. So that's VAB. And they find basically not very much. And this is in line with other studies from Norway also that look at these kinds of policies. So then there's the cheaper childcare, and in Sweden there's one study, but also showing really no impacts of subsidizing childcare on female employment, but a caveat is that that's already starting from a pretty cheap level. So subsidizing it further didn't seem to actually increase female employment. So all in all, the takeaway from the literature, I would say that these public policies seem to have a limited impact on the gender gaps in earnings or employment, or on the size of this of the child penalty on women's earnings. So what can we think of in terms of alternative or complementary explanations? And this graph Barbara already showed you, just to illustrate that norms may be very important in this respect. And also one thing that I wanted to bring up that I thought would be interesting, at least from a historical perspective, is matching in the marriage market. So who marries whom and what are the comparative advantages of spouses? So this graph is from a paper by Anielov and co-authors that look at the effect of childbearing on the within couple income gap in Sweden. And what this figure shows is just the how big of an effect that having a child has on the income gap within the household by how big the income gap within the household actually was before the child came. So the y-axis just shows the size of the motherhood penalty, basically, and how the change in the motherhood penalty, and the x-axis shows how equal or unequal were the couple's earnings gap to begin with, so before the child came along, and then it's for different years since the child's birth. And the one thing to take away from here is that in couples in which the wage gap or the earnings gap was very low, there was basically no long-run penalty of childbearing on women's wages. So this sort of seems to suggest that comparative advantage, or at least relative earnings potential within the couple, seem to matter for how you divide your time between different tasks. So then, to come full circle, what is the role of policy in affecting these margins? Well, we might think about individual taxation of spouses, even paternity leave provisions, childcare subsidies and availability. All of these policies, theoretically at least, should lead to the erosion of the single earner household. And most of the literature to date, including my own, really focuses on looking at specific reforms in isolation. And we might, to be able to actually say something about the effectiveness of these policies, we maybe need a better understanding of how they interact. And also we might need to consider the long-run effects of public policies more in a general equilibrium framework, because these things feed into each other, norms and comparative advantages in terms of household tasks or market work and the policies and so forth. Even if we can't find any short-run effects of specific policies, I think we still need more research in order to be able to say something about the effectiveness in the long run and how they change and shape norms. So yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we will leave the questions for the panel now and immediately bring up the Minister of Gender Equality, Åsa Lindhagen. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Åsa Lindhagen, and I am the Minister for Gender Equality and also have responsibility for anti-discrimination and anti-segregation. And I really appreciate being invited here for discussing this very important subject. And as a Minister for Gender Equality in a feminist government, closing the gender gap on labor market is one of my top priorities. It is also one of the 6 national goals for gender equality in Sweden. In my perspective, inequalities and persistent gender gaps and biases on the labor market are not only to be reduced, they are to be eliminated. And I think that research on policy to close the gender gap on the labor market is very important. So I would like to say thank you for the previous speakers for very interesting presentations. And I think that it is very valuable what we are discussing here, not only for the historical perspective, but also for the international outlook that you gave us by understanding international trends and processes. I think we are in a better position to understand our own context here in Sweden. And I think we need more knowledge on what works and what doesn't work to create a more equal society for women and men. in these findings, I was happy to note that the policy with the strongest evidence for reducing gender equality is subsidized childcare. But I think it's also very interesting what you talk about regarding the importance of norms in a society. And I think we need to discuss more about that. I also think it is important to address the question of work-life balance and to make it easier for both working moms and working dads to combine labor with family responsibilities. And this is not only a question about women's labor market participation, it's also a question for men's participation in the unpaid work at home and care for dependents. And it's also a fantastic thing to spend time with your children. So I think that men should get the luxury to do that more. Besides affordable childcare and parental leave and individual taxation that I would like to mention that are essential reforms in Sweden, I think for women's earnings and well-being and bargaining power at home, we need also to continue to do a lot more. Even though we have significant processes due to these reforms, gender gaps remain. Women continue to participate less in the labor market than men, especially when we look at foreign-born women. We need to do more regarding this. They earn lower wages, they receive lower pensions, and they take a greater responsibility for the unpaid work at home and care for dependents. And still, for most children, the mother's proportion of parental benefit days is considerably larger than the father's. And therefore, we must keep moving forward and find new ways in Sweden to close the gender gap on the labor market. I think that equality on the labor market is not only about wages and work-life balance. I also would like to say that it's also about feeling safe in the workplace. If we want to close the gender gap, we need to address the question about sexual harassment and abuse at work. So I would also like to mention the Me Too movement that made a large impact in the public debate here in Sweden and around the world when it birthed some 1.5 years ago. And all these stories that were told by the Me Too movement tells us not just that women are exposed to harassment on a big scale, it also tells us that we cannot achieve gender equality in the labor market without dealing with these problems. And if you remember, all the appeals were organized out of different professions. And I think that it is also important that we talk about this, that we must remember that the importance of accessible sexual and reproductive health and rights for women and girls, because this is about the right of every girl and woman to decide freely over her own body. And I think that this should be obvious to all, but sadly, this is something that is being questioned right now by conservative forces as well as right-wing nationalists that wanting to roll back the land winnings on gender equality. And I think it's more important now than in a long time in Sweden and all around the world that we stand up for the right of every girl and woman here in Sweden and as well as abroad to freely decide over her own life and her own body. I am a politician, and as a politician it is part of my commission to propose solutions to problems. So I would talk just a little bit about what my government has stated as prioritized regarding gender equality. And first, we need to ensure compliance with the provisions on the active measures in the Anti-Discrimination Act. I would like to mention that. And we have a national inquiry that will look over this and come back with proposals. Every employee has a responsibility to take active measures to make sure that there is no discrimination, for example, regarding wages or sexual harassment in the workplace. And we need to investigate whether more effective sanctions are needed against those who do not comply with the law. Second, I would like to mention that we need to increase the share that men take out of parental insurance. In 2016, a third reserved month for each parent in the parental insurance was introduced. And we have a national inquiry that has submitted proposals for a modernized parental insurance, which is now being processed in the government offices. So this is really important to move on with this. And third, I would like to mention that, as I said, foreign-born women participate at the labor market at a lower degree than men and women born in Sweden. So this will also be a key issue for the government during the coming years, and it's also mentioned in the January agreement between Social Democrat, the Green Party, and the Centre Party and the Liberals. So here we need to do much more. So these were three areas that are central to closing the gender gap on the labor market and making sure that women and men have the same opportunity for economic independence and security throughout their lives. To wrap my short note, I would like to say that the gender gap on the labor market is, even though Sweden is mentioned as one of the most equal countries in the world, a real problem for women and for men. Sweden would be a better country if the gender gap would be eliminated. It would affect women's incomes, pensions, and possibilities to live independent lives. And it would also stimulate growth in our economy. And men will be able to take a big responsibility for their children. And I am convinced that we have many men, many fathers in this country that would like to spend more time with their children, to build stronger relations with their children. And that is a good thing for the fathers and also a good thing for the children. So thank you so much for inviting me here. And that's what I would like to say today.
Thank you. So you may just proceed over to the panel tables, and we invite the other two speakers up here again for the panel part of the seminar. Okay, so while I let you, formulate your questions well in your head, I will just ask Barbara if you want to comment on Arizo's and Åsa's presentations, if there were any thoughts you had while you listened to the other presentations today.
Yes, so the thing that I found really interesting and that was touched upon in both presentations was about the role of fathers. So the idea of shared childcare is of course crucial, because when we're thinking about, for example, the interplay between family policies and gender norm, I mean, of course, family policies can go either way, either reinforce the mother's role as the primary provider of childcare, or introduce gender neutralizing childcare, as in the case of subsidized state-provided childcare or shared parental leave. So this is, I think, something on which we really need a lot of good evidence. Now, my sense is that the legislation on the father's quota of childcare is very much in its infancy, especially outside Scandinavia. I mean, Scandinavia was like a precursor. And also there is little evidence about it. So the little evidence I've come across hasn't found positive effect, hasn't found large effects on female outcomes. Now, I understand one of the reasons is that probably there isn't so much variation, because even introducing sort of the father's quota in childcare doesn't mean that the take-up rate is following. So, for example, I've been working myself on Swedish data for the mid-2000s, for 2006 and 2007. And in those years, so I understand that was before the introduction of the second month of paternity leave, but during those years, the father, in the median family, sort of the family in the middle of the distribution of childcare roles, the father was taking less than 10% of the total length of maternal of paternal leave. So there is a little bit of a friction between the introduction of sort of, in principle, father's participation to paternal leave and the take-up rate. So what should we expect in terms of impacts on the female participation rate? So why do we find no impact at the moment? Is it an issue of take-up rate? Is it an issue of very limited legislation? This, I think, would be very interesting to find out.
Yes, great. So I will open up now for questions from the audience, if there is any. Yes, please. And introduce your. And there's a microphone coming, and please introduce yourself.
So it's on. So my name is Lina Andersson, and I'm working as a policy officer for Unionen, which is a union. So I would like to ask, because sometimes you get to hear like this mother penalty is also general, that it hits women who also doesn't have children. That when women reach a certain age, you start to see a less investment in careers and salaries. Have you come across this in your research?
No.
Okay, so thanks for the question. So if you look at the gender wage gap, how it develops over people's life cycles, so mostly you would see men and women who are like who are like sort of finishing their education now or in the past few decades, very recently, entering the labor market in their early 20s with almost zero wage gap. So before anybody has kids, before anybody invests in sort of actual experience or job-related human capital, job-specific human capital, basically men and women are almost equal. And then a gap starts to emerge in the sort of mid-late 20s, and then it opens up in the 30s and even more in the 40s. And then towards like later years, the gap is highest. Now, the evidence that we have at the moment shows that most of this gap, the very big majority, is explained by children. So, for example, especially for Sweden, there is a study by Angeloff and co-authors a couple of years back that shows that before birth, there is indeed some gap between mothers and fathers, but very small. And then it opens up and permanently stays open after the birth of the first child. Now, of course, this has a very long-term impact on careers, and as you say, you could see their impact later on in the 40s and the 50s, because if the arrival of children implies breaks from careers, then of course this has a very long-term impact on the kind of job-specific experience that you accumulate, investment in your job, and then the penalty to requesting flexibility on your workplace, the penalty from taking breaks. So my understanding of this literature is really most of the gender wage gap is explained by children. And something that is striking is that the childhood penalty has been stubbornly high for the past 3 or 4 decades. So if you go back to the 1980s, there was a very big gender pay gap. And this was explained in roughly equal proportions, let's say, I'm talking about Denmark here, by children, education. Women in the 1980s had on average a lower education level, and then some other factors that we cannot really explain in the data, some sort of residual that is unexplained. So either unexplained factors, human capital, and children. These days, the part explained by children has remained at almost exactly the same level. The human capital component has gone to 0, and the residual component is also very, very small. So in a sense, especially these days, I would like to really emphasize that it's mostly about children. 30, 40 years ago, it was not. There was a lot more about human capital and possibly more discrimination in the workplace. These days, I think if we really focus on the childhood penalty, we would manage to go almost to the bottom of the problem.
Do anyone else want to comment on this? Or?
I can comment. I think we really need to make sure that fathers spend more time with their children, and we have a discussion a lot when we talk about the paid parental leave, that people should be able to decide themselves. That is one view, or that we should maybe just have legislation that makes sure that you have more daddy months, or what you should call it, and I think that we need to discuss more, as I said, about the father, that the fathers benefit benefit from spending time with their children, and I think that more fathers would like to do that. And also, I think we should talk more about the children, their possibilities to spend time with their fathers. And I think when we talk about these questions, we are talking about the norms that you are discussing. That, I mean, what do we think about being a parent, and that both men and women have a responsibility for their children. And we also see that when it comes to women, they take a much bigger responsibility at home, who is vacuuming the floors, who make sure that we have food in the refrigerator, and so on, and who spend time with the children when they are sick. So and at the same time, women are sick much more, and they are much more stressed than men. So if we make sure that men spend more time at home with their children, women will their health will get better, and we will. It's a lot of problems that would be solved, and the men get the benefit to spend time with their children.
Did you want to comment quickly as well?
I just have one comment. I think it's motivated to talk about paternity leave in this context, and making this how we allocate work within the household more gender equal, and paternity leave might be one of the key policy instruments there. But also at the same time, we have countervailing policies to that. I mean, if you look at how the career trajectories look like for women after birth, it's not only this short run effect. There's really a persistent drop in the so you go to part-time work basically, and we have legislation in the parental leave system that encourages part-time work. And if you look at the hours worked of women or tjänsteomfattning, you see that really decreases. There's a permanent decrease in the tjänsteomfattning or contracted hours of work of women right after birth, and they never jump back even when the kids are growing older. And I mean, we have legislation that sort of, if not encourages, allows women to do this. So you have the right to reduce your working hours with up to 25% until the child is 8 years old. And if you have that kind of policy, then what may be the effectiveness of adding an additional month of leave earmarked to fathers? So yeah, that was just a comment.
Great. So we have another question down here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. I'm Alexandra Lettefors. I'm from the magazine Dagens Industri. And I just have a question, and it's basically about what you're talking about, because there seemed to be a difference between politicians' view on the father's role and the research. And could you just repeat that for one more time? You said there was a lack of research on the impact of fathers staying at home, additional daddy months or so. But could you just revise that? What do we know about that, and how efficient is that kind of solution that many politicians suggest would be the solution of closing the gender gap?
So my sense is that there is some limited research. It's a very recent area of research, but there is lack of evidence of positive impacts. But I think that, Arizo, you're the best person to comment on that. You've worked on that, so.
No, I mean, so we have evidence from Norway and from Sweden looking at what are the effects of introducing these reserved or earmarked months in the parental leave system, this so-called use it or lose it. They're just called daddy days because effectively it really targets fathers, because fathers didn't use any parental leave before, even though they had equal rights before the introduction of these reforms. And we do see that they are effective in terms of making fathers use parental leave. So the first reform in Sweden, for example, really increased the share of fathers taking any leave at all. So it really affected the extensive margin. And when you looked at the introduction of the second month, men's take-up of parental leave increased by an average 1 additional month. However, when you look at did these reforms, does this translate into women actually getting improved labor market outcomes? Do they return to the labor market sooner than they would have if this wouldn't have been introduced? We don't find any evidence on these outcomes at all, but neither in Sweden nor in Norway. And looking at other types of outcomes that would give some kind of indication of how you share responsibilities in the more longer run, they're also we don't have any evidence, at least suggesting that these reforms had any impact on the longer run outcomes or on women's employment outcomes. And there's even some evidence, at least from the early reform, that I mean, there's some kind of resistance to these things. If you look at the women's take-up of these parental leave days that are on a flat rate increase, so they sort of compensate either with unpaid leave or with the leave that were paid on a lower fixed rate. So you have some kind of idea of how you want to share it, and that's preset, and then this shock comes and telling you to divide it otherwise, and that might not be what people want to do, and then they sort of adjust their behavior. But these are all short-run effects, and we can't really say anything about long-run effects and how it potentially changes how people who have not yet have children or formed families actually think about how they will plan their division of labor. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have one question there, and then over here, and then over there. Okay.
Yes, thank you. My name is Urban Funrud. I'm the CEO of the Swedish Securities Dealers Association. I've got a question. I mean, when we're talking about the pay gaps, etc., I mean, it's really playing along with the men's rules. It's all about economics. I would like to come back to what the minister said about the kind of well-being of families. Because, I mean, Sweden is among the happiest countries in the world, I think, according to all the statistics. But has there been any research done on families, kind of the well-being of families, how women feel and in families where they have taken more or less of the maternity or paternity leave, and or where men have taken a larger share of the leave? Because I think that is, in the long run, of course, what matters for families, but also for kids who grew up in these families with stressed mothers or more relaxed mothers or fathers.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, a research question.
Yes. Do you know if there's any
I can
research
just
on
say
that?
that there's currently a big project going on in which I'm involved, where we try to look at exactly these things. What are the effects of these paternity leave policies on the children's outcomes when you look in at their schooling and so forth? But I haven't seen very much research to date on those things. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we'll have to come back to the topic then. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ann-Katrin Dolium, and I work at Unionen, the trade union here in Sweden, as Lina earlier. I have a question that is a little linked to the question that the Urban, I think, had, is that there's a big issue around sick leave among women here in Sweden that is clearly linked to having small children at home. And that is a discussion that I don't recognize from the other countries where I have lived and worked. So my question is that a trend that you see in all OECD countries, or is it a Swedish specificity? And if that is the case, it's really an illustration that the current system does not work at all.
So your question is about sickness leave for parents? For women who, who might take more sickness leave because they may have health issues or mental health issues. I think this is a very interesting question. I don't have evidence. I mean, I haven't worked on that. I don't know the data of that. Maybe you guys know better.
No.
Well, we know that is a problem in Sweden, but it's a really interesting question whether that is something that is a problem in other countries. So
something that I've seen evidence for other countries, more notably the US. Self-reported information on life satisfaction and job satisfaction has changed over time. So as in the previous question, it was emphasized that we may really want to care about people's happiness with their own work-life balance. So if you look at the gender gap in life satisfaction over time, that has actually widened in the US. So some discussion is about what is responsible for that. And then along the lines that you guys were suggesting, some of that might be driven by the fact that women over the past, say, 4 or 5 decades, they're really increasing their total burden, their total work over the sort of 24 hours, because they're working a lot more in the market than they used to do 50 years ago. And they're not working so much less in the household. So total hours of work for women have actually increased a little bit rather than... So there's really an issue of a double burden. And then, of course, it's not just like physical fatigue, it's like mental fatigue. And then you can think really of like subjective well-being being affected.
Thank you very much. So there was a question in the back.
Hi, Carol Vicker from the Stockholm School of Economics. First of all, thank you for the very interesting presentations and talks. I think I already know the answer to this question, but in terms of the research, is there any research based on the condition for same-sex couples or couples where one or both of the parents define as non-binary? Here it's been very much moms and dads, but is there any research or any thoughts on research on other perspectives?
There is, of course, very little, mostly because, again, in the available data, there isn't so much variation in the types of couples. I mean, the vast majority of couples that we do observe in the data are heterosexual couple. But, for example, by looking at living arrangements, now in most data sets, we can also identify homosexual couples. And there is a little bit of research looking, for example, at the specializations of same-sex parents after birth. So I must say I'm really not an expert of this research, so I can't remember exactly all the details. So if I can remember one thing, there is a little bit of evidence of parental specialization after birth, even among same-sex couples. So basically, the spouse who was earning more before birth is also the spouse that takes less time off work to be with the child. But this kind of pattern of specialization is a lot less marked than among heterosexual couples. So this is the kind of broad evidence I sort of remember, but I'm not an expert of that.
I know that there's one study made on Sweden by some researcher who was at Uppsala.
Yes.
Ylva Moberg.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and who is at Sofie now as a postdoc. And they are doing a project on like maybe 3 or 4, I think, Nordic countries, collecting data now on this exact topic. So in some year, maybe, there will be more to know. More questions? We have room for one last question, and if no one in the audience wants to take it, I will take it. Okay, there we have.
Hi, my name is Diana Gonzalez, and I'm from the Stockholm Association of International Affairs. And I wanted to ask you, what's your view on quotas in parental leave? Has there made any research? Does it have a positive effect?
So, I mean, this is basically the type of policies that we were discussing that we called, we don't call them quotas, we call them daddy month reforms, or we call them earmarked days of parental leave or reserved leave. And so what we know is that they are effective in terms of inducing fathers to take up parental leave, but that they don't seem to affect women's labor market outcomes in any way.
So I will just ask the one last super quick question then. Now all the three of you get to choose one dream policy. Very concrete, very quick to implement in Sweden. So based on what you know about Sweden as well, what would be the preferred policy to implement in order to reduce one or more of these gender gaps on the labor market that we've been discussing? Who wants to go first? Arizo.
Okay, this is not something that I have thought about very much, but I do think that we might want to take a look at how these, how the legislation with respect to the right to part-time arrangements in connection to parental leave, how they look like and how they should be formed.
Okay, perfect. That's not an issue that we discuss a lot, so that's very interesting. Okay, Barbara?
So I don't know, perhaps going back to what Arizo was discussing about paternity leave, I think that for probably a proper reach evaluation of its effect, we should see a much higher take-up rate of paternity leave, because I think we're still talking about a small percentage of leave taken by fathers. So probably it's still a bit too early to figure out what are the effects of more sort of gender-neutralizing childcare on female participation and earnings, precisely because it hasn't been gender-neutralizing yet at all. So I would like to see more on that.
Okay, thank you.
I think we need to make sure that fathers do take more parental leave, but I think it's really also interesting to listen to you, and we need to have, research-based policies in everything we do. But I think it's also sometimes legislation is really important by also shaping norms in a society, and we need to create a society much more where we are expecting fathers to take responsibility for the children. So very happy to have the opportunity to listen to you, and we will continue to fight for more gender equality, and then the fathers need to take more responsibility at home.
Great. So thank you very much for coming today, and see you some other time. Oh yeah, it's you now, sorry.
Yes, on the behalf of SNS, I would also like to thank you, Agneta, and Åsa, Arizo, and Barbara for coming here today and sharing thoughts and perspective and research on these highly important questions. And also thank to you in the audience for listening and engaging in the discussion. Before you leave, I would just like to do some promotion for our public affairs program, SNS Samhällsprogram. Have a picture? Yes. This is a training program for executives in private and public sector. In the program, meetings with key decision makers provide unique insights into policy making from the local to the EU level, and seminars are mixed with study visits and informal dialogue. So if you would like to know more about the program, you can either talk to me or my colleagues here at SNS, or read more at our website. I know that there are still a few spots open for this year's program, which starts in the fall. So now you are welcome to continue the discussion outside over a cup of coffee. Bye, and thank you for today.